For as much as I like to brag on the daily about how cool and sophisticated my tastes are when it comes to video games, I think a lot of it does border on the fairly niche and obscure. Not in a disappointingly boomer-esque way like, oh, today's games aren't good like back in my day type of weirdo nonsense, but rather in that sort of primal desire to experience all the cool stuff that's out there, just waiting for you to discover. All sorts of weird experiences people might have missed out on. Games that maybe aren't exactly well known to the Western side of things. Maybe they've got an art style that's pushing the definition of abstraction. Or maybe the game uses some pretty convoluted mechanics whose sole purpose is to simply tie into the whole narrative. It's all around good stuff that deserves the time of the day and pretty much became the recurring theme to this whole channel. One of wanting to showcase the stuff I love that just so happens to fit that description to a T. It's less about trying to find the hidden gems through the trash and more about coming across games that are kinda jank but whose flaws you can overlook because of the sheer amount of cool concepts they bring forward. And the further you go back with those games, the easier it gets to find some really interesting stuff that either sold poorly, never got properly localized, or wouldn't even fit the definition of what people would call a traditional game nowadays. Titles whose legacies are carried to this very day by like 5 diehard fans tops. And I mean, hey, if most folks don't want them, that makes more for me to enjoy. Because if there's one thing that became quite the pet peeve for me recently, it's the sheer amount of people online who claim that the medium of video games as a whole is dying out. A lot of those folks are the same ones who only really pay attention to a fraction of what's available out there, actively snobbing the shit that sells for less than 90 Canadian chocolate coins on average. Like I've said in the past, it takes a genuine lack of self-awareness to call the medium dying in huge quotation marks and not be out there looking for more cool games to enjoy for yourself. The world is filled to the brim with so much fun stuff to explore if you only take the time to look for it. And yeah, some of it might be a bit odd looking, got some janky ass controls or game mechanics that maybe didn't age all that well. It's definitely gonna take time for some to adjust to it, but each of those games make up for their flaws with tons of charm and personality. In an era where narratives and character motives are practically shoveled down your throat, with every question answered and little is left for you to analyze by yourself, it feels refreshing to play stuff that doesn't feel the need to answer every little detail, stories that don't need to entirely make sense, gameplay that doesn't shy away from diverging from what you see on the daily, art direction that allow themselves to be weird and out there, music that gets to sound funky and nonsensical. And yeah, it's definitely gonna come off as pretentious or maybe shallow sounding for some folks, but why the hell would I want to play the latest big multiplayer, ass blaster, battle royale co-op shooter when I could spend the night playing Dark Tales from the Lost Soul, or like 95% of the stuff that never made it overseas? And by all means, it's not even like all AAA games are bad either. There's definitely some of it I do vibe with, but at the same time, maybe I'd like them even more if trends were to shift in favor of more vibrant and weird artistic liberties, rather than the whole overly saturated era of bland-ass, sepia-tone-ass, high-fidelity graphics-ass with visible hair follicles and all that shit. The more creative aesthetics, complete with esoteric concepts and color palettes for days. You know, the stuff you find all throughout smaller budget titles, AA studios, and indie games. But until the cycle of gaming art direction eats itself alive and rises from the ashes of big Western game dev companies, you're gonna have to catch me hang out with the cool boys, the Silver Cases, Tulips, and Evergraces of our world. And while I usually wouldn't bring terms like nostalgia to the topic, because that shit is definitely a huge double-edged blade waiting to stab me in the face, I feel like there's a certain feeling, at least somehow related to it. Kind of a longing for that childish feeling of wonder, of being 6 years old again and booting up that new game you've got for Christmas. And to me, the PS1 gives the same exact feeling as that Christmas morning. Though realistically I wake up at like 4 PM nowadays, but you get what I mean. Never having grown with the console myself until its bigger brother, the PS2, means there was a lot of stuff I had to play catch up with. The console's entire library is stacked back to back, filled to the absolute brim with tons of underappreciated titles, hidden gems, and bests of all time. Even the ones that never made it to the West feel alluring as all hell, despite the relatively intimidating language barrier. You know, it don't take me much to be happy. A weird premise filled with intrigue, a cool-ass FMV intro that don't give a fuck about your modern stylistic sensibilities, and maybe a sprinkle of edgy protags ripped straight out of the early 2000s. It's through those weird and obtuse games, as well as that desire to find new things, that today, I give you the warm and cuddly present that is straight up the video game equivalent of Lynchian storytelling. Because yeah, when it comes to being out there, the game we're gonna talk about is pretty much the peak definition of it. So strap the fuck in, get comfy, and prepare to embark on the intergalactic journey that is Planet Laika. Created as a collaboration between the devs at Quintet, mostly known for their work on the extremely ambitious RPG and underrated gem Brightest, as well as the devs at Zeek, creators of the cult classic Kowloon's Gate, Planet Laika comes pretty fucking close to being the actual, factual, undeniable best game I've ever played on the PS1. Not even joking, it ticks every boxes and keeps on giving even after finishing it. While Quintet was responsible for the programming, sound, and more technical aspects of game development, the team at Zeek were tasked with creating the scenario, concepts, and graphics. Because of that, the game's overall design and ideas are very reminiscent of the stuff you could find all over Kowloon's Gate, with themes that explore both faces of the same coin in a very Manichean way. Light versus darkness, good versus evil, the yin to my yang type of beat. And with a game like that serving as a sort of spiritual predecessor, you can tell it shows hella in its execution. Even though those concepts for most parts were unfortunately gatekept by the admittedly pretty intimidating language barrier. Though fortunately, unlike Kowloon, Planet Laika actually got a fan translation this year, by these fine folks right here. The basic premise of the game starts off with the crew of a rocket ship heading to Mars on a mission to investigate rumors surrounding the end of the world, the existence of an unknown supernatural being, on top of having to find a previous expedition member who went missing there in the most cryptic of manners. Your team consists of Tadler, the captain and headstrong figure of your ship, Noon, the foul-mouthed engineer, April, the biologist, as well as yourself under the guise of a silent but ever-so-present protagonist. Laika might be your given nickname by your team, but you actually get to pick your first name, with a very stereotypical knob added to its end to fit the Russo-Martian aesthetic. Though, what the game ends up offering beyond that is a little far from just that, that's for sure. The game blasts you in the face back to back with abstract concepts like how you learn at one point that the original Martians who lived there became extinct after trying to put on human faces, faces of which were given to them in some sort of peace treaty between them and the residents of Earth, or how Mars is entirely controlled by a purple fog monster called Evil Mind, the physical manifestation of the Martians' ill will, the very essence of the planet itself manipulating its inhabitants by torturing them with their own trauma, forcing them to confront their respective flaws and weaknesses. Not only that, but you also gotta contend with bringing back to Earth Colonel Galil, who after cutting contact with his crew and subsequently everyone else, decided to stay on Mars and become its self-appointed god, but only after one last transmission. God is dead, I am the light. To say the game starts off abruptly would be a massive understatement. I mean, the first thing you see past the main menu is some masked weirdo spouting exposition about multiple personalities living inside of each other's brain space, three self that exist as one. But as strange as that might sound from the get-go, I really fuck with the whole thing. The entire game is wrapped into this genuine, dreamlike aesthetic, with a world that feels both ethereal, yet entirely hostile at the same time. Complete with character designs dropped straight out of the most esoteric-looking early 2000s CGI cartoon. Just some really good shit all around. Something special I've noticed about Laika is how relatively unknown it is, not only to foreigners due to never having released overseas, but also to native Japanese speakers. The game's easily outshadowed by its bigger brother, and the very few people I've met who did know the game by name described its aesthetic as traumatizing no less. Because I mean, seeing shit like that all around the place, I can kinda see why. While it'd be easy to describe Planet Laika from what I've already said as this creepy, overly intimate look into the general fuckery that is the human psyche, viewed through the lens of a bunch of anthropomorphic dog-human people, I ain't about that life. It's got way too much to offer to be described in such an overly generalizing type of beat. From real-world literary references, science fiction, Soviet pop culture, retrofuturism, to even religious texts of various backgrounds. The game's filled to the brim with so much good stuff that of course caters to my weirdo stylistic sensibilities. It's a unique experience that feels like this weird cross between Majora's Mask, Okage Shadow King, and Moon Remix RPG Adventure. Yet despite all my praise, this wouldn't stop the game's release from absolutely bombing financially. Small budget, relatively short length, strange ideas that wouldn't always reach fruition. Say what you will about it, but it's very obvious to me that Planet Laika was done from a place of passion, and owes a lot of its ideas to some really interesting influences. But rather than bitch and whine about what did or didn't happen, I'd rather talk about what made it so special in my eyes. Because for what's actually factually there, it's crazy ambitious for the time it came out, and features some of my favorite visuals and storytelling moments of the entire medium. So of course, my ass will pour my heart out to you, the viewer, about the PS1's true, forgotten masterpiece. There's always going to be some games out there that I find myself naturally gravitating to, or resonating with more than others. Most of the time because of some really simple feelings. How it looks, how it feels, if it's got a good cover art or interesting stylistic decisions, rather than purely because of how it plays, mechanically speaking. Though that shit does matter too in the grand scheme of things. Just less than the rest for me. But when it comes to Planet Laika, it's fair to say the game fires on all cylinders when it comes to that. The box art in its toy rocket perfectly mirrors the spaceship you're seen traveling in at the start of the game, which too is a reference to the toy rocket Laika received as a child on one idyllic Christmas morning. In a way, it represents almost this idealistic view of a future not so far from here, yet completely unknown, shrouded in mystery. The idea of discovery is one I value a lot in games, and I guess in some way you could tie that to some sense of nostalgia. Like I said earlier, there's a certain childlike wonder of exploring the infinite possibilities of what's out there, just waiting for you to discover. The game's selection of backgrounds, while relatively modest, I think there's maybe like 12 of them tops if you don't count the reused ones, each brings something new and intriguing to the plot. The world itself in all of its crunchy, low poly resolution becomes one with the story. Each new location adding onto the narrative's twists and turns in a really cool way. And while it definitely lacks a proper map, the more you play and explore around, the more you create this sort of mental image in your brain of the world around you, all while appreciating the environment the game presents to you. The ambiance is just cool as fuck with this sort of retro-futuristic, almost cyberpunk take on what a colony on Mars would even look like. A lot of the buildings at the start are clearly inspired by the 1920s Soviet-style constructivist architecture, but all of that quickly devolves into the obscure and esoteric as you delve deeper and deeper into Mars. Same thing can be said with our main cast, who are fairly standard looking, despite the whole dog face thing, but nothing compared to the rest of the NPCs. The folks who live here are all some degrees of fucked up looking or even fucked up acting. The game's cinematic and FMV format are all up my alley like nothing else. They bring an even bigger fever dream-esque atmosphere to the whole thing, with scenes that will stay engraved in your mind for years to come, and concepts that err on the side of nebulous. All of this perfectly fitting the convoluted nature of the game and its world. You know, for something with a fairly small budget, the art direction is just splendid with this almost mixed media feel. And on top of that, you've got some funky music for days with tracks that feel entirely nonsensical on a first listen until they hit you with the leitmotif. Like how they reuse parts of the snazzy intro theme and its polka dot disco vibes all the way near the very end of the game, in a bunch of super tense scenes with downright uncanny visuals. I just love this shit. Meanwhile, heading back to the story, witnesses have reported that they saw the face on the surface of Mars illuminate itself, a semi-factual element of the story taken from real life but enlarged to more mystical proportions. Because if you aren't aware of it by now, Mars does indeed have a face, or rather a hill in the Cydonia region of the planet, whose 1976 photograph looked eerily similar to a face. In reality though, that's only because of shadows hitting the rock formation at the moment the satellite snagged that pic. But trust me, that was enough to unnerve a fuck ton of people back then, and me too after playing through this game. Knowing of the team at Zeke in their previous work, it's not exactly out of line for them to use elements of real life or legends and expand upon them, to elevate them in a way that makes them seem more mysterious than they already are. Like how Kowloon's Gate not only used the real-life walled-off city of Kowloon as a setting, but also mixed it up with stuff like Feng Shui and a bunch of Chinese mythos. The face, the link between your outer self and your inner self, is also a huge recurring thematic in both games, but especially here in Planet Laika. From an outsider's point of view, the game could easily fall into the JRPG/action-adventure territory, with its collectible items, inventory, NPCs, and random battles. Though in reality, it's much more closer to a glorified visual novel with some degree of interactability. You travel from scene to scene showered in esoteric imagery, but realistically with fairly straightforward instructions. Instructions that are, oftentimes, obfuscated by rather convoluted puzzles. I think a lot of its design has to do with the traditional survival horror game type of ethos, minus the whole tank control thing. You get somewhere that's blocked off, you gotta find the item that unblocks that path, so you move your ass all the way there while trying to minimize backtracking or aimless wandering. What makes Laika stand out from that traditional format though is its main mechanic of separate personalities, and how each of them bring their own puzzle-solving capabilities. One of the game's main themes, tying to the aesthetic, mechanic, and narrative side of things, is the topic of identity. Your protagonist Laika actually has a multiple personality disorder, which is something that plays heavily into the overall gameplay loop. You see, each of the fuckos you'll meet along the way gives off this colored aura when you approach them. Said aura, of 3 different colors, represents the sort of evil Laika is absorbing by interacting with them. Once you've absorbed enough of a certain color and found a mirror, you can transform into one of 3 characters, indicated by the little gauge at the bottom left of your screen. These 3 are categorized neatly not only by color but also by type. Ernest, represented by the color red, is the animal type in Laika. You'll be using him and his short temper to strong-arm answers out of folks and lift heavy things, like that one door in the mineshaft town. Spacer, the psycho type, represented by the color blue, is instead the more intellectual aspect in Laika. You use him and his quick thinking to solve puzzles that require a more diplomatic approach, we're gonna say. Meanwhile, yellow represent the aspect of greed, of physical attachment to one's appearance, the visual type Yolanda, who's also the sole female personality, something fairly avant-garde for the time. Well, the whole game feels pretty avant-garde with its theming, but you get what I mean. A lot of older games fucked around with the topic of gender identity, oftentimes through less than savory means, so it's really cool to see it not being relegated to a punchline for once. No one really bats an eye at Laika's gender or identity switching on the go like this. Characters always take you at face value, some like April even accepting the idea wholeheartedly. Though to be fair, I think with a setting like this on the daily, the least of your concerns is your homie's preferred name. A lot of the NPCs also share some form of split personalities, and depending on whether they're inhabiting one alter ego or the other, they'll have different names for twice the amount of characters. And while I know a lot of those NPCs get the whole reuse assets with color swap treatment, I think it's really cool to see each of them switch depending on the story beats, especially when it's about the folks who do get new models, like how Feng and Veronica's personalities vary not just in a matter of character design, but also in speech, mannerism, and overall goal. The identity-changing plot and its mechanic has a huge impact on the story because each personality effectively serves as its own character, with detailed backstory and motives to boot. Ernest is your typical tough guy, no joking around type. Spacer is the more level-headed, analytical, think before acting type, while Yolanda doesn't exactly keep her tongue to herself. Those 3 pivotal personalities end up contrasting perfectly each other, but also our main character Laika, who remains silent for the entirety of the game. Though all that time, it kinda makes you wonder why the 3 of them are confined to living only as an extension of our silent protag. And even more so, why does that one stay that way the whole time? The game's narrative can feel at times pretty damn confusing, because the dialogue can be so symbolic that you're kinda forced to guess as to where to go next. And even when you do know where to go, you might have to head somewhere entirely different to trigger an event before having to backtrack all the way to where you started. The item names too are also sometimes pretty fucking obscure, in such a way that it won't always be obvious to know what you're supposed to do with them. In fact, a ton of them aren't even useful gameplay-wise, and serve more as exposition for minor characters, taking the shape of symbolic memories that you can later analyze at a fortune teller's crystal ball. And while I know this is probably enough to discourage some less than hardy folks from trying it out, I feel like that's a huge part of Planet Laika's appeal. While the game does give you some hints throughout the whole thing, it always manages to keep its mystery and doesn't feel hand-holdy whatsoever. It allows you to come to your own conclusion over the course of the entire story, and I vibe really hard with that. Another cool thing about Planet Laika is its combat and how unique the whole thing feels. The devs opted for this weird Pong-inspired battle system, where you're on one side of the screen and your enemy's on the other. You have this small energy ball called the Mine Core, which you have to use to reflect enemy projectiles. You can't actively shoot them yourself, and the ball moves up and down on itself, so you can only really affect where it's heading on a horizontal scale, either closer to you or the enemy. The whole system feels like this weird timing-based rhythm minigame, but oddly enough, it becomes almost second nature really fast. Every time you hit a shot, it reflects it at your enemy, either destroying more oncoming shots or actively damaging them. It sounds really simple on paper, but the execution is neat as fuck, especially considering the era it came from. I'm sure the devs could have easily tacked on some late edition, turn-based battle system to the thing and called it a day, but instead they went with this intuitive but high concept shit, and I vibe hard with that. So I think the one big downside to it, or upside depending on how you want to look at it, is that the enemies only really appear when Laika's transform into one of their 3 personalities, which is usually when you have to backtrack, so you find yourself in one of 2 positions. If you're a completionist and take time to revisit older areas, a lot of the enemy placement will start feeling dangerously close to padding. Meanwhile, if you're the one and done type of guy, you can practically avoid 95% of all encounters and pretty much face only the major bosses. Either way, it's not actively hindering the experience in the grand scheme of things, but it's definitely something to consider. The game's story is fairly linear. There's only really one ending, and the whole thing takes about 8 to 10 hours tops for a full playthrough. There's apparently a couple different ways you can game over in Planet Laika, but I've ran into absolutely none of them, so let that be a testament to how the game plays. This is more of a cryptic visual novel experience in survival horror's clothing rather than anything too blood-pumping. Stress-inducing though, that can be debated, with shit like this flying at you at 100 miles an hour. Replay value is only really added through swapping around characters while exploring around Mars and talking to different folks at different moments. There's apparently a few scenes that can only be seen when you have a certain mind scope level, at certain places, at certain times. It's all good, but in no way necessary to get a full experience when it comes to the story. Though the additional context you'll end up getting that way does add to some characters in neat and flavorful ways. As for the story, the first couple of hours gives you absolutely more than you bargained for already. Our main cast eventually reaches the colony in order to question folks around there, but the only person from your crew who actually makes it there is April, who's just as confused as you. Meanwhile, the colony itself is filled to the brim with cultist-like folks who worship the radio waves emitting from Venus, plastic surgery addicts who want to return to their former faces, the human ones, in a last-ditch effort to reach heaven, in order to avoid the extremely ominous-sounding Judgment Day that's apparently coming. On top of having drunken bar goons trying to beat on your ass. That's not even mentioning the abusive creepo uncle who's less than subtle about what he's doing with that kid. With all those folks rummaging around, you quickly come to realize that Mars and the evil mine was less than kind with the mental state of its residents, but especially our crew. We later meet back with Noon and see part of his past, visions of an enraged mother who took pleasure in disposing of her husband right in front of her kid on fucking Christmas no less. These visions, in turn, turning Noon into the shell of his former self, or at least the one we met at the start of the game, now turned into a shivering mama's boy, elected mayor of a dreamlike town hidden behind a mine shaft? Taking residence in a cottage only accessible from entering a very specific door? Not even joking, the screen transition leads you to an empty field that has the biggest of vibes when it comes to color schemes if you don't use that specific door frame to get to the cottage. It's really cool! And what's even better is that it's only the start of a chain of events that would become even more abstract and stretch the definition of conventional storytelling. Just some insanely striking scenes back to back, and I can't help but resonate with Planet Laika and all of its weirdo vibes. To be honest with you, there's always this one big elephant in the room whenever it comes down to any form of discussions about a quote-unquote weirder side of video games, or even any form of outsider art. It's been like that for years, and no matter how much you try to avoid it, there's always some guy out there in the comments with the most lukewarm take about it. The dreaded, the disappointingly bland remark that is, look at how weird this is. Clearly the developers must have been on drugs while making this. I'm willing to bet that if Planet Laika got into the public eye just a bit earlier, people would have had the same reaction to it than they did with LSD Dream Emulator. Because of course the concept of imagination is stranger than fiction for some. And I mean, yeah, I'm not saying it's never the case. There's definitely some creatives out there who prefer to create that way. But I feel like it says a lot more about the folks who say that type of shit than it does about the artist, or even the art itself. Because to be frank, I don't think games like that are all that strange in the grand scheme of things. Like yeah, their visuals divert from what you'd expect to see on your average video game, but it's not all that far from it. Cause not only do you find tons of surreal imagery in plenty of mainstream media, but also a lot of that said imagery is deeply rooted into a certain sense of realism in one way or another. Osamu Sato's work on LSD Dream Emulator, or even Kikiyama's work on Yume Nikki, are effectively exaggerated retellings of someone's dream diary. Their abstraction entirely based on that sort of oniric fantasy that you too could potentially achieve with like maybe 8 hours of sleep per night, or whatever doctors recommend. Fortunately, it's gotten a lot better over the recent years, and that sort of comment makes itself less present in the gaming sphere as more people open up to the idea that some games can just be what they are, abstraction and all that. Because yeah, I can't exactly sugarcoat it either. Planet Laika doesn't hold its punches when it comes to stylistic or plot decisions. After all, it's a story about a planet that changed to fit its residents' very psyche, a dreamlike world that hides you from the pain of daily life, or on the other hand, that holds you hostage and forces you to confront it head-on. A major plot-relevant character gets split into parts, only to realize that those parts make for the greater part of another character, his own split personality, the universal man hidden somewhere, close but always out of sight. Our main character, Laika, and their origins when it comes to their own split personalities, and what each says about them. There's a guy who's hell-bent on performing sacrificial rites by bearing alive pairs of twins, who eventually gets his own comeuppance in this pretty striking scene. A hidden prophecy split in 5 parts, where absolute good meets absolute evil. The alter egos of each character, already quite strange by definition, giving ways to even stranger plot points unfolding at any moment. There is a pillar at the bottom of a zone hidden by a two-way mirror that only works when sandstorms aren't active. That pillar is made of evil, like not even joking, the straight up meta-contextual concept of evil itself. On one side you've got Native American inspired shamans who talk about the dichotomy and balance of good and evil in your very soul, while on the other you've got enemy designs derived mostly from traditional African masks. It's hard to describe Laika without having folks raising an eyebrow at you. There's so much jam-packed in that game, and while it is esoteric like nothing else, I feel like it's a lot less weird than some would make it out to be. Said like that, it's a lot to digest for sure, but the story makes a lot of sense when you experience it firsthand, all by yourself, with each event, as weird as some of them are, unfolding progressively. So huge props to the translation team for working their way through this one, because not only is it a pretty buck-wild story in its native language, but localizing it into English without losing too much of its original meaning and intricacies must have been quite the task. Especially knowing that Laika has a pretty infamous reputation from native Japanese speakers, who too deem the game nonsensical and overly abstract at best. I can't imagine getting this shit for Christmas at like age 4 and having to decode what seems to be like cryptic intergalactic religious text. But at the same time, it's also that sort of vibes that really hooked me onto the game. The world is strange, the characters all act weirdly, but that's just how it works and it's charming till the very end. The story works incredibly well through these 18 layers of abstraction and that purposeful lack of information or even clear destination. It adds a lot of tension to the central plot. You never know what's coming at you, whether that be story-wise, gameplay-wise, or even just visually. You're constantly barraged with nonsensical scenes, but each of them hits that perfect spot. Just me and the homies, hanging out in the parallel realm. The entire subplot about our protagonists and their crew works wonderfully. Every small detail and new perspective serves to bring the story to an incredibly satisfying conclusion. Though it's true that to get to said conclusion, you'll often have to go for some solid chunks of time without much going on. Just walking around, talking to NPCs and trying to find your way to the next objective. As thorough as the translation was for Planet Laika, the game is already obscure enough, and there's no clear written walkthrough out there. As a matter of fact, I think there's only 2 full English playthroughs here on YouTube, and both seem to cut out some moments here and there. So you know, guide game it would be, but a guide isn't exactly what you got on hand type of deal. Sometimes you'll find yourself thinking you've got the solution for a puzzle, only to get stopped mid-backtracking by an NPC who just strings you along to another plot point or arbitrary detour. And even though it sounds lame as fuck said like that, the game has this whole vibe of being the passenger on a ride rather than the conductor, and I fuck with that majorly. You're taken from place to place and you're not really asked to do much but take in the vibes, the atmosphere, and the story the game's offering to you. It makes for this very fun experience. The game's never worried about the small details. It introduces and ditches plot points like it's nothing. At multiple times throughout my playthrough, I found myself reading certain passages of text that would indicate a link to a certain character and event, only for it to lead absolutely nowhere. But instead of whining like a bitch about it, I just ride the fucking wave. The game's got a lot to offer, so much so in so little time that you end up just picking what you want. Some plot points aren't that important, some lead to nowhere, but that's just how things go in here. The world's big and the story's implications even more so there's no time to waste. Diving even deeper into Planet Laika's story, which means huge spoiler territory to the three of you who haven't played this absolute masterpiece yet, but basically, when trying to analyze Planet Laika as a whole, the theme of identity keeps coming back through every plot thread. In Japan, there's this social concept of the one and the tatemae, literally translating to true sound and facade respectively, which usually refers to a person's true feelings or desires and the relationship those have with the opinions and behaviors they exhibit in public. A person's one can be the opposite of what is expected by society or what's required of you, stuff you'd rather keep hidden except to your very close ones. On the other hand, the tatemae is what's expected by society, and in turn those may contradict your core values. In many cases, it leads to folks outright telling lies in order to avoid exposing their true feelings, and this very concept ties perfectly into Planet Laika's core thematic approach. The numerous references to faces, separate personalities, and true alter egos is one of the game's many aspects that ties into the concept of true self. Similarly to how Kowloon's Gate approached the topic of identity by using concepts taken from Chinese mythology and psychology, it's not a surprise to see the same in Laika, though with slightly different source of inspiration. In-game, the face, not the one on the planet, but your own, represents a certain form of individuality, as shown through the history with the former inhabitants of Mars. Lore-wise, those Martians were originally more of a hive mind, and only became aware of the concept of individuality when they encountered humans and did the whole face-trading swap thing. The action of suddenly having a want, a selfish desire for that individuality, is what ended up destroying the core of their civilization, almost taking the form of an illness for them. The last act they were able to do before completely going extinct would be to carve the face you can see on the surface of the planet, some calling it a sick memento of what they stole from humans, while others would see it in a different fashion, almost like a forewarning of what truly was their downfall. There's actually more than one parallels between real-life history and the fictional Martian history of Planet Laika, the colonization of the planet being extremely reminiscent of the actual factual colonization of America or even Australia. The first people who were sent to Mars were effectively exiles or prisoners, chucked into a hostile environment rather than being left to croak inside a prison. Like in America, the colonizers eradicated the former inhabitants of Mars through a gift of something deemed as a friendly trade: faces for Martians, pelts for Native Americans, both effectively leading to the eradication of their respective people. Even more curious is that you could interpret the dog faces our main cast wears as a sort of reminder of humanity's crime, one that would haunt them like the effects of post-colonialism does. Though in-game it's practically impossible to just forget about it and move on. With those new faces, on the daily will characters face what their people have done, which explains why cosmetic surgery is presented this way in-game, both as a selfish desire to return to the face they once had, but also as a way to scrub themselves clean of the sins of the past. Feng, who helms the salon, being probably the biggest example here. Her behavior could be associated to someone extremely religious or superstitious to a degree, thinking that the only way to scrub herself clean of her sins and to save herself from the imminent destruction that's coming is to construct herself, as well as others, better faces in huge fucking quotation marks. She ends up constructing this mirror of judgment to make sure that no one has any impurities left. Another parallel that would play into the plot, the presence of mirrors oftentimes revealing the true self, but in this situation, obfuscating it, purposefully clouding it away. While Planet Laika takes a lot of inspirations from many sources of mythical and religious text, The more obvious ones to folks will probably be the Christian parallels. Stories like the Day of Judgment, the Black Rider, that spatial equivalent of one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, but also straight up name dropping the Book of Revelation mid-game, like, whoa, that's defo not something I was expecting to pop up. Same thing for the aforementioned Native American inspired shamans, the voodoo magic, and the enemies resembling traditional African masks, amongst many other concepts, all of which serve to bring a certain aspect of introspection to our main characters, an element extremely important to Planet Laika's overarching narrative. In the end, a lot of it is up to interpretation. There's not really any source available that either confirm or deny any subtext from the game, especially because of its obscurity, even in its homeland. But it's still a lot to think about and appreciate. The game hides a lot of its more interesting aspects through its subtext and convoluted storylines, but I think that, in the end, it might be what makes it so special to me. The whole game has this almost Lynchian feel to it, especially in the way it portrays its main themes and how each of them are conveyed throughout the story. By all means, the game was released on the PS1, so you would think you're now walking into something explicitly, visibly violent or sexual by nature. But truth is, part of the game tackles on some fairly touchy stuff, so it's definitely one of those play at your own risk type of game. Without going into too much detail, one of the more important concepts at hand in Planet Laika revolves entirely around dissociative identity disorder, and you meet more than one character suffering from it. The theme of PTSD stemming from domestic abuse. It comes in various forms and is explored to various lengths. There's flashbacks involving physical violence, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, even medical in some cases, with mentions of procedures being enforced on unwilling characters. This includes both towards adults, but also towards kids. And while there's no voiceover, no graphic depiction, or even wince-worthy description, these scenes are still designed to leave a massive impact on you. I think my favorite example of this is the story of Cosmos. This kid who, held against his will by his abusive uncle, got his face changed to correspond to Red's desires, an act that turned him quote-unquote pretty, at the cost of his own happiness. No longer feeling like his true self, he denies those selfish desires thrusted upon him, and asks of you to help him return to his real face. Granted, one of a dog, but one he felt comfortable in, effectively accepting his condition, understanding the purpose of the dog faces as a sort of narrative equivalent to the sins of his ancestors. It's one of those rare moments where we have the impression of actually witnessing some sense of positivity on Mars, instead of looking at tragedy happening right around the corner, popcorn in hand like, man, that's fucked up, isn't it? It feels really nice for once. Later, we learned that Red himself was abused at a young age by the hand of his own uncle, taking the terrifying form of a mass of bubbles who, and I quote, wants to scrub him clean. Just reading that shit out loud makes my stomach churn. And while some games would use that fact to justify and try to humanize its villains, like, oh look at them, they were hurt too, here this backstory element is exclusively presented to talk about the everlasting aspect to this cycle of abuse. The way Project Laika approaches its themes is done in a fairly respectful way for a game that effectively looks like this at times. It ain't perfect in no way, but I feel like the way it approached identity disorders, mental health, abuse, culture, religions, amongst many other things, could have been approached in a much more displeasing way, especially since the whole thing comes from fucking 1999. It could have easily resorted to pointing the finger at how weird these things be, but Planet Laika has some sense of decency and respect in what it's trying to convey. The project was defo someone's baby, and its story feels straight from the heart. While the game talks a lot about faces and asses, it also approached the idea of the interior self. Firstly through the evil mind, which, might I remind you, reverted Noon into a shivering mama's boy, made Tadler lose his chill with visions of his deceased lover slash best friend, and now he's turned into a bird. Even April, which defo got off better than the last two, also seems to be affected by the ill will of the planet. Strangely enough, it seems to be only Laika who's barely affected by the whole ordeal, only subjected to visions of the past here and there, serving to explore a bit further our silent protagonist. But it's exactly because he serves as an empty shell, devoid of personality for most part, that you can come to understand Laika's true motives and even reason to exist. Games with silent protags aren't exactly uncommon, but here it's contextualized in a way that really helps the story. Laika was so traumatized by prior events in their lives that they straight up lost their personality. And it's also precisely because of that trauma that Laika manifested 3 separate personalities to shield them from any further damage. Instead, these 3 new characters all act with their own motives, which tie into Laika as a character themselves. But to know exactly why each of them act a certain way, they'll have to do a lot of introspection, oftentimes through ritualistic means, to truly understand what brought them together. Ernest and his deep-rooted desire to protect his seemingly invisible little sister stems from Laika's inability to protect his very own. When his mother suffered from an unfortunate miscarriage, at the hands of her doctor, hired by her abusive husband to purposefully do that shit. Not to mention Sergei, Laika's stepbrother, who makes sure to drive the point home that he hates your fucking guts the entire way through. Following that, Laika went full-on nose in the books in order to become a cosmonaut, distracting himself from his shitty home life, something that would eventually lead to Spacer, whose sole presence manifested from a schoolbook representing Laika's intellectual pursuits. Meanwhile, Yolanda was born from Laika's love toward his mother, and their inability to protect her as well in the cold final moments of her life, harboring more than hate for the circumstances that brought on her passing. In reality, each of those characters have their own role throughout the story, but also in regards to Laika's own personal history. And that's not even mentioning the later appearance of a 4th personality, taking the name of Phoenix, effectively reborn from the ashes of a possible teratoma lodged all cozy in Laika's brain, in a scene that would shake anyone to their core. By the end of Planet Laika, you'll have explored not only your psyche, but also the psyche of every resident on Mars, for better or for worse, that's for sure. And it's through those vivid introspections, garnished with the coolest visuals known to me, that you'll learn of a prophecy that you must collect, one that speaks of good and evil, light and dark, and of course, a pair of twins. A pretty clear reference to the concept of yin and yang, used more than sparingly throughout the game. This prophecy bringing both the death of this world, but also its resurrection, which ties the knot perfectly into this seemingly ever so cyclical story. As the game progresses, you slowly learn more and more about Laika's life prior to the events of the game, and it becomes clear that maybe their silence is more of an act of complacency than it is for the sake of having a self-insert for you to project onto. Laika's conscience isn't exactly as clean as it was made out to be. The combination of their multiple personalities effectively hiding some pretty pivotal plot points when it comes to their past. Through beautifully illustrated, holiday-themed vignettes and cinematics, another act of Christian symbolism throughout the game, you learn more about what happened on that fated Christmas day. Relentlessly abused by his new stepfather and stepbrother, unable to protect his pregnant mother, Laika and his separate personalities committed an act hidden till the very end of the game. His memories purposely locked away behind the faces of each protagonist. Ernest burned down his stepfather's shed, killing his horse. Yolanda poisoned the man who took away her mother with spiked booze, and Spacer framed the stepbrother for it all. Vengeance being the key element that turned our protagonist from victim to oppressor, a recurring theme you can spot all throughout Planet Laika. Except that by the end, the entire trope is turned onto its head. By the time you face off against Galil, the true main antagonist, in this very ironic way, you learn of Laika's true identity as the twin of prophecy associated with pure good, despite what he effectively committed in the past. This is because he distributed his sins through his separate personalities that he was able to reach that status. That could be easily interpreted as some way of showcasing the Buddhist concept of separation of self to reach enlightenment. And while I do think that it could be seen as a bit of a stretch to a certain degree, I really fuck with the idea of showcasing a fight between 2 polar opposites. Our silent protagonist Laika effectively overcoming their troubled past to reach pure good, while the main antagonist Galil, who considered himself to be the most pure of the two, effectively reduced to pure evil by his own selfish desires to be the one to usher in the rebirth of the universe. To talk about Planet Laika is to come back and try to analyze an actual fucking psychological journey with all of its twists, turns, and intricacies. The ideas showcased are so novel, each scene still anchored in my memory, and the way it approaches topics done in such a genuine way that the few flaws it has are completely eclipsed by the sheer amount of stuff the game chucks at you at Mach speed. I don't think I ever mince my words when I talk about games, because I feel like honesty is a big priority when it comes to talking about video games or this channel in general. But I want it to be clear. I wasn't fucking around when I call this one of the best games I've played on the PS1. None of this aggrandizing hyperbole or overly modest coward shit. I love this game unabashedly, and I'm not afraid to say it. It's never been exclusively about its art style, mechanics, execution, or even really the story in any individual sense of it, but rather because of how each of them connected to each other and how in turn they ended up resonating with me, creating this really memorable experience altogether. Too many folks worry about needing a quote-unquote proper reason to like a game, having a concise thing they can point out to and explain why they fuck with it. But really, it doesn't need to matter all that much. Stuff will just inextricably resonate with you, and in turn you'll end up vibing with certain things naturally, just based on your own feelings and preferences. You don't have to worry about what other folks think of you if you like a game that has fucky controls or weird jank. It ain't the end of the world. Nor does it really need to have this complex web of mental gymnastics. All the time I catch folks prefacing everything they say about whatever piece of art they fuck with sentences like, "I know it's not gonna be for everyone, but..." We all spend too many years of our lives worrying about what other folks think. So maybe now's the time to just give in to your own weirdo stylistic decisions, right? It's something I wish more people understood instead of beating each other on the head about whose taste is better, or if it's even valid to like one thing or another type of overly dramatic discourse shit. And in a strange way, Planet Laika ends up embodying that feeling really well. Instead of focusing on the small details and useless minutia, it looks at you straight in the eyes and says without a shadow of a doubt, "I walk because I was born."